Why was Jesus crucified? Let's look at three aspects of this. Aspect number one, Jesus threatened the powers of the day. Now, you've got to remember that in the time of Jesus, the Romans occupied the Jewish nation. They were in charge. They would allow the Jews to have their ceremonies and their God and their little areas of synagogue and different things. But actually, they were an oppressed people. So the power brokers in those days were the Roman authorities, but also the Jewish leaders. The Jewish leaders held a lot of power in that society to control things. And when Jesus comes on the scene and begins to teach and gather people and gather the wrong kinds of people, and everyone is flocking to him rather than going to the Jewish leaders, they felt threatened. And they tried at numerous times to shut him down, but they couldn't outwit him. They were amazed at his teaching. They tried to bring charges against him. At times they would try and pick up stones and just stone him, but Jesus just walk through them, he wouldn't care. So at a point of frustration, they eventually go to the Roman governor and they say, there's this Jesus. And he'd call himself a king, you know. He's calling himself a king. He's saying he's more than Caesar. He's more than you guys. And the Roman governor, who had at that time had to quash a couple of problems with the Jews already, a couple of uprisings, begins to go like, oh man, I'm on shaky ground here, you know what I mean? Like, I can't have the Jews, I can't have another character coming up and saying he's the king, he's going to overthrow the Romans here. So he's forced by the Jewish leaders to move against Jesus. You see, the Jews couldn't crucify someone. They couldn't put someone to death. They could condemn them. They could bring the charge, but they couldn't do it. They couldn't swing the hammer. They had to get the Romans to do that. And they felt threatened. And then they passed that sense of being threatened onto the governor so that he would do their bidding. So that's the first reason why the Jews were considered quite a pesky people to the Romans at the time, always arguing about one thing or another. So this was not good news when he heard about this new king. So that's the first thing. He threatened the powers of the day, both Jewish and Roman. Secondly, the charge that was actually brought against Jesus was one of blasphemy. They arrest Jesus in the night, which is illegal. They hold a court during the night, which is illegal. They paid for 2 witnesses to come and speak against Jesus, telling lies. And even these 2 witnesses couldn't match up, but they ignored that. They ignored every form of legal process that they, as the Jewish nation, had set out. But eventually, in that sham trial, they forced Jesus to say something which then they claim is blasphemy. Now, you've got to understand, blasphemy nowadays is not the same as it was then. Blasphemy now, people can say what they want about God. People curse God and each other, and we don't deem it any great thing. And there's certainly in the majority of countries, or pretty much all the countries in the West, there isn't a blasphemy law. But you've got to remember, in these days, there was. And the penalty that went with the charge of blasphemy was death. So firstly, he threatens the powers of the day. The Jews go to the Romans and they say, oh, there's this king. And then they trump up a charge against him of blasphemy. And it's this charge that they then take back to the Romans and they say, crucify him. You've got to crucify him. But there's a third thing going on here. Jesus, from the moment he began his public ministry, would talk about that he had come to lay down his life for the forgiveness of sins. One of the titles that Jesus had for himself was the Son of Man. He would say the Son of Man has to lay down his life. He wasn't backward in coming forward when he spoke about this. He was very open about it. In fact, the New Testament Gospels tell you that essentially Jesus was the only child ever born in order to die. That was God's intention. That was Jesus' intention. Essentially, it was God's plan from the start that Jesus would suffer on the cross and make a payment for sin. That he'd take my brokenness and your brokenness and he'd close that part of us off by taking a punishment for us in our place. That's what the New Testament preaches. So why was Jesus crucified? He threatened the powers of the day, both Jewish and Roman. He was crucified technically because he committed blasphemy under the Jewish law. But really, thirdly and most importantly, he was crucified because he chose it. He chose to do it, to give his life. If you want to learn more about that, go to near the end of any of the 4 Gospels and you can read the crucifixion account for yourself. But it's an interesting question, why was Jesus crucified? Of all the figures in history, he is so famous for his crucifixion, for his death. I hope you know that the word excruciating was invented to deal with the pain you get on the cross. The excruciating, it means from the cross. So it's a great question to ask, and it's the crux of the Christian faith, this thing of crucifixion. The crucifixion and death of Jesus is a key question to seek an answer to. I hope this channel helps. Check out the other videos. Till next time, take care of yourself. Laters.